Hello, everyone, and welcome to Solving a 78-Year-Old Mystery, the Wakasa Memorial. My name is Kimiko Mar, and I am the co-founder of Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages. But more importantly, I am a Topaz descendant. My mother and her parents and my aunt and uncle were all incarcerated in Topaz from 1942 to 1945. So tonight's program is actually very personal for me. You may notice that I don't typically do a lot of programming in regards to the Topaz site in my work with JAMP, and it's because I've felt like I was not able to. So tonight is actually very important to me personally, and I thank you all for joining us. Um, this program is going to be about the murder of James Wakasa, who was shot and killed by a guard April 11th, 1943. We're going to begin with a short clip from the documentary Topaz that was created by director Ken Verdoya. This documentary is a uniquely important historic record because it contains the voices of Topaz survivors who remembered the Wakasa murder. We thank PBS Utah for allowing us to screen this on our website, and it will be available until 11 p.m. tonight on the JAM Pilgrimages website. The link will be in the chat and also in the video description below. After that, we will be showing a short timeline of the discovery of the Wakasa, or I should say rediscovery of the Wakasa Memorial, and then a conversation with Nancy Ukai, who found the map of the killing site that was drawn in 1943, and Mary Farrell, one of the two archaeologists who rediscovered the monument last year. And finally, after that, we will have a live Q&A. So please be thinking about questions that you would want to ask and put those in the chat. And so now we're going to begin with the clip from the documentary Topaz.
They said that we were put into camp for our own protection, but the machine guns and the Army rifles were turned not out, but inward.
For camp residents, the direction the guns were pointing passed from conjecture to reality just before sundown on April 11, 1943. 63-year-old James Wakasa, a cook for the Army in World War I and diagnosed as being hard of hearing, was walking one of the camp's mongrel dogs roughly here along the southwest perimeter of the barbed wire. Wakasa had already been cleared to leave the camp to accept a job in the Midwest once a job could be lined up. There was a guard tower in front of him and there was one behind him, and 17 miles of open rangeland separated James Wakasa from the nearest town. Suddenly, a single shot rang out from the southwest guard tower, the bullet striking Wakasa squarely in the chest, passing through and severing his spine. According to one estimate, Wakasa was dead before hitting the ground. While Wakasa's death was a certainty, the events leading up to the shooting and the events immediately following the shooting quickly became mired in a complex web of contradiction and outright deception. Wakasa's body was immediately removed from the area and taken to the military police compound rather than the camp hospital. The Army issued this press release stating that Wakasa had been shot, quote, while attempting to crawl through the fence, and that he had failed to heed 4 warnings from the guards. But camp residents were convinced the Army story did not make sense.
From our viewpoint, we could not imagine a man and his dog trying to jump over the fence or go through the fence or whatever.
Now, the guard didn't have to fire. That old man couldn't scale that fence, barbed wire fence anyway. And as I say again, they said that the rifle was supposed to be pointed outwards for people that might harm the Japanese Americans. And then to have that happen, it was inexcusable.
I was frightened. because this meant, and of course the rumors were going like crazy, but this meant we were totally vulnerable. We were helpless. There was no way of defending ourselves from anybody who just got trigger happy, wanted to shoot us.
Tension was thick at Topaz when the next day dawned.
Well, as we come into camp, we could see groups of people standing around the buildings, very quiet. Every one of them had a club or anything that he could find that it could be used as a weapon, was equipped. The atmosphere was extremely tense.
Camp residents went out on strike. Thousands turned out for Wakasa's funeral. The military police deployed machine guns and tear gas bombs to repel the riot they thought was imminent. Only reassurances from camp director Charles Ernst that a full investigation was in the works eased the tension. A military board of inquiry was convened at Fort Douglas in Salt Lake City to study the shooting. The board cleared the soldier of any wrongdoing in Wakasa's death. But records of the investigation obtained from federal archives undermined the Army's published version of the shooting. The investigation brought several facts to light. First, Wakasa had never actually come in contact with the fence. He was at least 5 feet away from the barbed wire, walking parallel to it at the time he was shot. Second, records indicate that Wakasa had raised his hands above his shoulders, an action the sentry identified as a move by Wakasa to go through the fence. But further testimony indicated that Wakasa had only raised his hands when he was walking parallel to the fence, straight towards the southwest guard tower. Finally, the sentry testified that he did not intend to shoot Wakasa, that the bullet that had struck Wakasa square in the chest, severing his spine, was in fact a warning shot. Camp officials reported that guards had fired at Japanese on 8 occasions in the 3 months leading to the Wakasa shooting. Civilian camp director Charles Ernst pushed for and got new restrictions on the military's use of force. The Wakasa shooting was part of a convulsive period at Topaz and the 9 other relocation camps scattered throughout the inland area.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, Nancy. It's so good to see you face to face.
I agree. I guess what I'd like to ask is it's an honor to meet you, and I just wonder what is your background in archaeology?
I was an archaeologist for the Forest Service for about 35 years. I retired in 2010, and even when I was working for the Forest Service, I did a lot of work with my husband, Jeff Burton, to help him with some of the relocation site archaeology.
I had been going to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and I've been fortunate to have a friend there, and I go there and dig around the files. And when they roll out the cart with the boxes and the folders, and you open it up, and just amazing records, some which have never been seen before. You can tell because they're clipped, they're paper clipped or something in a way that you can see that people haven't really rifled through them before. I actually don't remember the particular moment I found that map. It would be good to say that I did, but I did know that it was special because it was hand drawn. It was extremely detailed. There was the blood spot. There were measurements. There was little drawings of the floodlight of the pole. And so I tucked it away. And frankly, we didn't publish it until several years later. The National Archives is a treasure. It's like this last scene in Indiana Jones where they're pushing the ark into the archives. And, it's like going to be there and maybe somebody might find it and the world is going to end. I'm not saying that necessarily we're going to find that in our papers, but maybe someday we'll find the photograph of the monument. That is, referred to in the records. I'm looking at this. The military took photos. The military also took photos, or the government took photos of the blood spot. I've been looking for that for a long time. Those would be really important to have. What we do have are a lot of text records, people writing back and forth about what to do, and the fact that there was resistance by the inmates right after. The following morning, the military was armed with tear gas and machine guns. That kind of gets glossed over because the government was trying to downplay any sign of resistance. It came 4 months after the Manzanar uprising, as you know, Mary, and it was also coming right after the loyalty questionnaire, a month after that. So there was a lot of unrest and anger, frankly. When you saw this map that I found at the National Archives, what did you think? Because when I found it, I thought it was unusual because of the amount of detail, and also because it was hand-drawn the day after Wakasa was killed.
That map is amazing, and I can't thank you enough for what you found in the National Archives. The detail, the precision, well, like you say, the immediacy of it being done just a day after, even marking that there's a blood stain. It's very, very somber, I think, that map. But also not just the map, but the letters you found. I hadn't realized there was such a cover-up. I mean, I hadn't realized there was such an effort to erase that monument when it was built.
It's true that the minute he was killed, that cover-up began because the military crossed the fence into the camp, which they're not supposed to do. They took the body, and then by the following day, people already had the narrative that Wakasa was escaping through the fence, which he wasn't, because he was shot through the heart and the spine, parallel to the fence, and fell on his back. But anyway, when I found that map, I was puzzled because the military records and the court-martial said that he was killed about 240 yards from the guard tower, and the map showed it was more like 314 yards. It was in feet and inches. But
yes,
that discrepancy was there, and I didn't really know what to do with that.
Well, I think that the map, there could be a couple of reasons that's different than what the military. I guess we can't really trust what the military was saying, given that they were dishonest about him trying to crawl under the fence, and probably dishonest about him not yielding to the warning shouts. that he supposedly got. But I also think that it's possible when George Shimamoto made the map, he was maybe pacing or using a surveyor's wheel. It may have been, I believe his map is more accurate than what the military had estimated. They may have been just going off what, maybe they were even thinking, how accurate could somebody shoot from that far away? I mean, that is astounding that the bullet pierced his heart when it was from over 900 feet away.
Yeah, that's 3 regulation football fields away.
Yeah.
Hard to imagine that distance, one bullet traveling that distance and piercing his heart, and then saying that that it was an accident or that he was escaping.
Yeah.
So when you saw that map, what made you, did you say immediately, oh, let's go? Because we published this article September 14th, and I think the following weekend, you drove from California to Utah.
Yes, it was definitely an inspiring map. I think Mr. Wakasa's story is inspiring, and just the fact that his memory had been erased by the military, his monument had been destroyed by the military, that to me, it made it imperative to see if there was anything left. So yeah, it was a good excuse, I guess, to get out of Owens Valley when the smoke was terrible here. It was hard to breathe.
It was also during the height of COVID.
Yes. So when we drove, and also Jeff was just in the middle or towards the end of chemotherapy. So he was probably anxious to do something more important than get infusions. I mean, for his life's sake, right? So he really wanted to get back to work. And this seemed a very good project.
So were you expecting to find it?
No. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but we were hoping to find maybe a few fragments of concrete, just a few broken pieces maybe, or some small cobbles. The way it was described in the Assistant Secretary of War's letter, it sounded like it had been totally removed. And then the director of the WRA at Topaz, he said it had been completely removed from site. So we thought we'd have to be like real archaeologists searching for little tiny traces of concrete or something that would still be there. But it there was a lot more left than we had expected.
When we also wrote our article for the 50 Objects website, because the official report said, as you say, everything's been removed and they had to destroy the monument, we just thought that was that. And in fact, we had no illustration because although there are photographs of it, because the Assistant Secretary of War referred to looking at the photographs and complaining that there were pieces left around and please clean it up, we just thought, okay, it's gone. And so to illustrate the story, actually David Izu, our photographer, went to Home Depot, bought a bag of cement and dumped it on a piece of paper because it was like, okay, that's the demolished monument.
Yeah.
So when I got an email from Jeff Burton saying, subject line, Wakasa Monument found, I didn't even know what that meant. And then when I read it, I just was stunned.
Nancy, I think we were stunned when we found it. As I said, we expected a few very small remnants of concrete or some cobbles or something. The fact that they had, and when we found it, we had no idea how big it really was. We could see just the smallest part of it level with the surface. It was not at all protruding from the surface. So
How did you know that was it?
Your map. It was because of your map. It was close enough, and it was unusual enough that there aren't those kinds of rocks naturally occurring in that area. It's mostly sands and silts. It was part of the old lake bed of Lake Bonneville, so there's not a lot of large rocks that occur naturally there.
So can you take us through a step-by-step kind of process of how archaeologists approach a site like this? Like, I guess you started at Guard Tower 8 footings, but how would you even know where to begin? Are the footings there?
The footings at Guard Tower 8 are still there. They were pulled out of the ground. Have you seen any of those Guard Tower footings? They're like an iceberg. They have a small, square, nicely formed piece of concrete that the guard tower leg was attached to. But underground, they're huge because they have to support an awful lot of tension, torque that the guard tower might put on it because it's up on, it's raised above the ground. So they pulled them, but they couldn't really take them anywhere. I think it'd be hard enough to pull them. So they're lying around. They probably took them out to do some work on the ditch that's there or to do some road work. Maybe they pulled them out when they had a large machine. It would not be easy to move those. So they weren't moved very far. And you can kind of tell there are 3 guard tower foundations at Topaz that are still in place. So you can tell by looking at those where they were situated in relation to the security fence.
So can you tell us how, what do you use? What equipment do you use? What kinds of expert equipment and what do you use to measure out?
Oh, it's kind of low tech, I guess. It's a tape, a 300-foot tape. And we started with, we attached it to the ground with a chaining pin. It's just like it's like a big sewing pin, only you can stick it into the ground through one end of the tape. And then you pull the tape out 300 feet, mark it, and then do that again and again and again because it was so far. So I guess the main tool is your eyes because you're just on the lookout for something that looks a little different. Maybe slight change in vegetation. We were, like I said, we were hoping for a piece of concrete or a cobble or something. Maybe some artifacts that had been placed there in his memory. So once we got too close to the distance indicated on the map that you found, then we started looking very closely to see. But it was such a big stone, we didn't have to look too hard.
What did you feel when you saw it?
I was overwhelmed. I just thought, oh my God, this is it. This is where Mr. Wakasa died, or close to it. And this is where his friends put up a monument. And I'm sorry, it makes me emotional just to think about all that. I think there's a power in being at the spot where something happened. And with that stone in place, we felt like we were there. We were there back 78 years ago when it happened. So yeah, it was kind of overwhelming. I know you can't think about Mr. Wakasa without thinking of all the implications of what that meant for people who were interned, incarcerated at Topaz, to be walking your dog and be shot. 2020 was, to me, the summer of Black Lives Matter. So this was another case of somebody being the wrong ethnicity or race, just minding their own business. I'll tell you what else I thought. I thought that is a big rock. Even though we didn't know how big it was, we thought that is such a big rock. The people who put that monument up, they wanted Mr. Wakasa to be remembered. They wanted his death to be memorialized. And so it wasn't just a few cobbles put together. It was a real effort, I think. The fact that they had used such a big rock in the monument, and then that they had found a way to leave it there when the administration and the military were telling them, get rid of it, it's inappropriate. It suggests that it was not right for the military to murder somebody there. So I think that was really impressive. I guess we felt obligated to tell that story. It's, it's not our story. It's Mr. Wakasa's story.
It's kind of an amazing thought that these landscapers hauled this. Do you have any idea of how they did that? How it's said to be about 1,000 pounds. We don't know.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? I mean, and especially if I think one of the letters said there were 2 landscapers responsible, but they must have had help. And that's entirely possible that there was a lot of people that were involved. But have you seen the way Japanese gardeners move big rocks with sometimes with a tripod, and also with like rolling, I don't know what you call them, like a rolling things, like you could put like lots of round logs in front of it, push it onto it, and then pick up the logs behind it and move them over. And so it's almost like a railroad sort of thing, a conveyor belt. That's what they use nowadays, is a piece of a conveyor belt from a factory. And so they probably had, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a Japanese gardener, but I've seen them work, and it's fascinating to see how they can move stones that are so large. And then to raise them, what I've seen is erecting a tripod with pulleys, so that, it could be just 3 long poles with a pulley centered in it. And then with that, you can tie ropes or something around the stone and then set it up the way you want.
You could lift 1,000-pound stone with using that method?
Yes. Yes, as long as your poles are strong enough, and your wraps, your ropes, your ties, and your pulley. But if they're landscapers, they probably had access to that equipment, because at Topaz there is, they're not as large, but there are some decorative rocks imported near the Buddhist church. And so those were probably moved with permission from the WRA. And so I'm guessing that they had that equipment.
It's really interesting to think, did they go into the mountains and find this stone, or did they have it in their inventory? Or, I mean, that's something, unless we find diaries or something, we won't be able to know. But let's get back to how an archaeologist would, we talked about how they might have placed it. How would an archaeologist remove that stone? Well, if they were to remove it at all, I understand archaeological theory says don't leave things in the ground, don't destroy the context.
That is totally true, because even the most careful archaeological excavation is destructive. For archaeologists, the context is as important as the thing that you're concerned about. The context, the place, tells you so much about what happened and maybe why it happened. But for an archaeologist, nowadays, in the olden days, archaeologists, as you probably have seen, would just go and take what they wanted with archaeological methods. But now archaeologists are a lot more aware. We've been told, it's not like we're so smart, we've been told that is very disrespectful. And so now, before any ground disturbance or collection or excavation, we would consult with the descendant community. And that's true for Japanese American incarceration camps or concentration camps. It's true for indigenous sites. It's true for anything. That the past is important to all of us, but it's somebody's heritage. And so now I think the first step before an archaeologist would remove something like that would be consultation with the descendant community, whoever they are. Now, there's different ways you can excavate something, but the typical way an archaeologist would do it is to set up a grid, measure everything, document everything, photograph everything on the surface before you move anything. Because, as I said, archaeology, once you start excavating, you're destroying that context. Maybe you've seen these in archaeological excavation. Everything is square. Everything has to be square, because it was something like this stone. You would want to very carefully examine whatever concrete is around, because Nancy, they might have written something in that concrete. Maybe they didn't have time to write something on the stone, but they might have put something on the concrete. And so you would document, where is that concrete? Because maybe the way they demolished the stone, maybe you could kind of reconstruct exactly how it was. I mean, they didn't go to all the trouble that the military and the WRA wanted them to go through, right? They just buried it. But it's possible they might have done so in a way that we could reconstruct the way it was erected. Little pieces of concrete stuck on the stone, or impressions in the concrete that would fit up against the stone. So it's like a puzzle. I guess it's a 3D puzzle that archaeologists would be really careful about. Okay, then they start digging. The grid, the square, would be big enough so you could dig without disturbing the stone itself. So, you wouldn't be sitting on the stone, digging up next to it or something. The grid would be big, and you would excavate in layers, and you would screen everything that came up, because maybe there'd be something there that would be another clue. Archaeologists are such optimists. We're always thinking there's going to be a clue in this dirt. And so we screen everything. Maybe there's a coin somebody put in, or a button, or maybe it's accidental. Maybe somebody lost something while they were, doing this work. Anyway, so we would go down in 10-centimeter levels. That's kind of standard, unless you see some change in the soils that would warrant a different stratigraphy or examination. And then you would leave the stone right where it is, and then dig out around it so you could see. And the reason you need to have these square walls that I was saying, or square pits and straight walls, is because you could probably see the original pit, the outline of the original pit. Like there'll be, like the regular dirt will have strata from when the sands were laid down, or in the lake, the different lake beds. But when they dig a pit, it makes a pit in there. Then when it refills, it's not going to look the same. It's going to be pit shaped in the sidewall. You'll be able to see it. You'll be able to see, okay, nice layers, and then all of a sudden, big jumble in the sidewall. And so I would be curious, how big of a pit did they make to bury this? And what else did they put in there? Did they put a memento in there? Anyway, so I'm real concerned about the pit, not just the rock, right? So then, am I going on too long?
No. In fact, somebody I know said, gee, are his ashes in there? Because after the funeral, he was cremated in Ogden, Utah. And there is record saying that, what should I do with the ashes? The inmate who had possession of them was trying to find the next of kin. And this person I know said, well, they could have tossed some ashes in there. We don't know. And I thought, well, I guess that's true.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that could be true. His ashes could be in there. They could be at the bottom of that pit.
And I guess there's technologies which allow you to recognize human remains.
Yes.
But
yes.
Of course, that would have to be done at the time of the excavation.
Yes, and you probably could have recognized some of the ashes anyway. They're not like wood ash. Bone ash is different and recognizable in excavations. A lot of cultures cremate their dead, and so it's common that you have to find cremated remains. So yeah, that would be after you moved the stone. But archaeologically, what you would have wanted to do after you had dug down further than the stone all around it, it's called pedestaling. Like you have this, like say this is the stone and here's the dirt underneath it. You would leave the stone there, and then you would like dig around a little bit around the edges, because the rest of your pit's down here. And then you could wrap a tie around it and then lift it straight up. You want to lift it straight up, because if they had written something on there, you don't want to rub it against the dirt or sand. It might erase it. what if they wrote it in charcoal or water soluble paint or something? Dragging it would not be a good thing, I don't think. And so you would lift it straight up using a tripod, maybe, like what the gardeners might have done. Have it go straight up. And then after you remove the stone, you want to very carefully remove the dirt that was underneath it and look for things like bone ashes or mementos or anything. So excavate that slowly and carefully and also screen it. So all of the sediments from your pit would be screened so that you could see if there's any artifacts in there.
So, so the Utah Division of State History has released some photographs that were taken by a state official who was there that the stone was excavated. And in one of them, you can see that a forklift is dragging the stone from the hole, from the opening, and it's dragging it. What would you think about that as an archaeologist?
It's not good. It's not, it could, like I said, it could, dragging the stone across sands and silts could erase any inscriptions that were on it. It could damage the stone itself. When we saw the stone, there was a crack in it, and we wrote in the article that we thought it would need to be very carefully and gingerly looked at in order to see what was on the other side without hurting the stone itself. No, and the other thing about dragging is you're destroying that context that I was talking about. You're not going to know what their pit looked like if you just drag something through it. You're not going to know if there were any mementos placed with it. You might even mess up some of the concrete that was there that was going to give you a clue on how it had been set. So that I saw those pictures, Nancy, and it made me sad.
And then what would archaeologists do with the opening after if the decision is made to remove it, and you already said that that's a decision usually make after talking with, consulting with descendants and the community. But say that the decision was made to take it out and then you've removed it, then what do you do with the opening? Do you just fill it back up, or do you leave it open? Do you put a fence around? What do archaeologists do?
Well, typically in the past, archaeologists would put something on the floor of their pit to mark that it has been disturbed. So that could be a coin dated to the year of the archaeological excavation. Some archaeologists put like landscaping cloth at the bottom of their unit so that in the future, somebody will know that that's when that unit was excavated. I guess we have great ideas that there'll be archaeologists in the future that will want to know what we did. And they'll be able to reconstruct it even just from the way the earth is. But we would probably refill it with the same earth because it's all been screened, remember. We've passed every bit of it through a 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch mesh screen. So we'll know there's no artifacts in it. And then we can put that back into the hole. And then we don't usually mark it on the surface. We usually try to restore the ground surface to as close as you can to what it was before.
And what kind of documentation is being done?
Oh, so much paperwork. Every single level has a form. Every artifact will get cataloged. Every rock will be drawn. The sidewalls of your unit will be drawn and photographed and measured. And if you are so lucky as to find the original pit outline, you'll certainly document that with photographs and measurements. And take soil samples maybe to test the soil, do a color match to see so that you can describe the soil carefully to geologists or other archaeologists. Any artifacts you found, this kind of depends on the descendant community, and the community at large too would be analyzed, cataloged, and if the community wants, they could be put in a museum, or they could be put back in the hole. You know, it kind of depends on the cultural values or the traditional values.
In the case where something like this historic monument to someone who has died, and it's 78 years old now, what kinds of ceremonies? I mean, I know for the Japanese American community, there would be certain ceremonies that one might plan and carry out at the time if there was advance notice and the ability to discuss it. But have you been aware of other kinds of public participation in excavations?
Oh, in the archaeological excavation? Yes. Not for something so sacred as this, but at Manzanar, there's a community archaeology program where descendants, Japanese American community volunteers pretty much decide what is going to be excavated and then participate in the actual physical excavations too. And if they have time, they are always invited to work with the artifacts, to analyze the artifacts and catalog and curate them. So yeah, that can be so powerful and so meaningful, because when Manzanar has had people who lived at Manzanar, who were incarcerated at Manzanar, participate in the archaeological excavations. And one of them, who recently passed, said, "You can't begin to imagine what it's like to be stuck here at Manzanar until you work at an archaeological excavation." And I don't mean that it's so horrible as being incarcerated, but what he meant was the weather, the wind, the sand, the dirt, the being outside with no relief. That, is a benefit of archaeology and also a curse of archaeology, which he experienced as a teenager when he was at Manzanar.
So what do you think now? Frankly, we don't know if the hole has been filled. I assume it has been, but I don't know. What can be done to preserve what's left?
Well, if vandals had done this, if vandals had taken the rock, what archaeologists could do is, it's called a damage assessment. And I don't want to use that term with a museum, with what the museum has done. But if it had been vandals, then archaeologists would probably go back and try to impose a grid on top of their hole, re-excavate it, screen everything, see what they might have left behind, see if there are any vestiges of the original pit, if you can see it, or that's probably obliterated by the most recent excavation. But you would kind of calculate how much disturbance there was and just try to reconstruct what was there before the disturbance best you could.
You're mentioning vandals. There's a claim that the monument was preemptively excavated because of the risk of vandalism. As an archaeologist and knowing what's involved in locating it, finding it, and so on, what is your view on that? That somebody could have read about it and find the footings and find it and then vandalize it?
That assumes a lot of things. One, that people reading Discover Nikkei are wanting to vandalize something so important to American history. and to Japanese American history. Two, that they would be so careful. I mean, how many people would take a 300-foot tape and go out there and do that sort of measuring? And then third, it wasn't that evident. There had been a survey before us that didn't notice it because they didn't have your map, and a survey after us that thought it was just concrete. So it's not that noticeable. It was flush with the ground. So what would, supposing a vandal did read Discover Nikkei and did go out there with their measuring tape and did find it, what would they do to it? I don't understand what a vandal would have done. I mean, I guess they could have shot at it. They could have painted it. But why, if they were going to do that, why didn't they do that to the other Wakasa memorials? To that tree that was out there, or to the sign that was out there? I mean, those would be a lot easier to vandalize than a rock that's flat against the ground. And those are easier to find too. So
What are those markers?
Oh, have you seen it? There's one that's like a tree. It was like a stump of a tree, only a tall stump, and it had Wakasa carved into it and then painted over us with white, so you can see it very easily. And you can see that from the road. And there's a...
Do we know who made that and when?
No, it was there when the archaeologists did the survey, I think around 2001. It was there, and the somebody who lived near there said he had painted it, but he didn't claim to have made it. So it had been maintained by a local person, and I could get you his name if you want to follow up on that. And I think we have a picture of it in the article in Discover Nikkei. There's also a picture of a sign that was put up by some, I think, a Boy Scouts or somebody from Delta.
Right.
Okay, so that's the other one that seems like.
There's one, it was actually put up by the White River Academy. It's
Okay,
kind of
that's
a service project, and it's in the wrong place, but we were very moved that, because we didn't know where the spot is where Wakasa died. And one of the things that to me is amazing is that all the focus has been on the memorial site and the memorial to Wakasa, but actually what that map shows us is actually where he died.
Yeah.
Which we haven't known up until now. And I feel like there have been ghosts out in the desert, and now we know the spot where he died. And there's one photograph of the excavator, or the person who was hired to do this work, and he's sitting in front of the barbed wire fence, and then right behind him is the stone that's just been excavated. And since we know that Wakasa died 3 feet inside the fence or so, 3 or 4 feet inside the fence, parallel to it, the stone is sitting right on top of the spot, or very close to where Wakasa would have breathed his last. So for me, when I look at that photograph, I'm really sad because the people who are there don't understand that they're sitting on, well, not only sacred ground, but it's also a crime scene because it was covered up from the beginning. So it's not only the desecration of hallowed ground in a spiritual place, which has never been recognized or known of, but now it looked to me like a construction site, and it looked like people who didn't know were trampling on areas where people had died, where people had tried to have a funeral but couldn't, who wanted to put up a memorial but were denied, who put it up anyway, who were then forced to take it down. And then 78 years later, no one was there to weep, to say a prayer, to light incense.
Oh, Nancy, that is the main thing. That is the big thing. The archaeological information that we could have gotten, that's nothing compared to that lost opportunity to memorialize, celebrate, commemorate his murder. That to us is the main thing. That's the power of that place, to be there, to see that, to experience that. I think that that's the part that makes me sad. I think that's the worst.
It's really emotional for me. I was born after the war, so I didn't experience topaz. But when I was a child, my mother, I remember one night at dinner, said they didn't have to kill him. He was deaf. Okay, one of the myths about Wakasa is he was deaf, and he wasn't deaf. But I remember as a child thinking, why is she getting so emotional? Why is her voice raising? Why is her face getting red? And then I began to research it for the Topaz Museum script. So I began to learn about his life, and then to find that you and Jeff Burton had discovered it was just this amazing feeling. So then when I got the email saying, just a quick report about this morning, the stone has been lifted, I was crying. I was surprised at my own emotion.
Yeah.
I didn't expect it to have this physical effect on me. And even now, when I look at the pictures, I'm not an archaeologist, but when I see the stone being dragged from the ground, I feel like it's being pulled, it's reluctant, it's like being a birth that doesn't want to happen. So that's my kind of subjective interpretation, but it's been really helpful to hear what a professional thinks about it and would do, so that we can hopefully learn about, so that this doesn't happen again.
Yes, that's my hope too.
And I also used to think of this as being a topaz story about this man who was walking his dog at 7:30 on April 11th, 1943, and then was shot from a great distance through the heart, and the cover up and so on. But I'm realizing it's really the story of all the camps in World War II. It belongs to all of us, Japanese Americans and Asian Americans. And then I'm thinking, you know, this is a story that was buried, literally it was buried, and the history was not able to be told through this. And so it's an American story as well. And the significance of it to me is growing.
Oh, I love that. And one of the reasons that I love working with this World War II incarceration archaeology is because it seemed like we were getting better. It seemed like the government acknowledged that it made a mistake, that it paid some minimal, but still reparations, and that we were trying to acknowledge things better, but with making things national parks or national historic landmarks. So I think that this felt like a real setback, that a museum would just go and take that stone.
The stone seems to be outdoors in the courtyard. Is that a safe place for it to be during the winter time, or should it be covered, or what should be done with it now?
Oh, I think it would have been safer in the ground, but I would like, it would be, honestly, I'm not sure. I think it should be covered. I think, but you don't want to encourage any mold or mildew on it. Delta's pretty dry, but if there is any writing on it, rain is possible could wash it away. So I'm not sure. I think they should consult a conservator. Believe it or not, that's a whole different field, how to make sure things are properly taken care of, because in the ground there's a certain measure of protection by being in the ground. So maybe the museum has a conservator on staff that could provide good guidance.
The article that you and Jeff wrote in Discover Nikkei was titled "A Story Meant to Be Found." And I wondered what you meant by that. Do you think that the landscapers could have left a little bit of that stone wanting it to be found by people generations later?
That's what I think, Nancy. I believe that those Issei were badass. They were not doing what the administration told them to do or the military told them to do. Well, they were kind of to the letter of the law, but not to the spirit. So they left that so that somebody would remember, somebody would find it. I mean, they could have put a little tiny bit more dirt on top, and we never would have found it. The museum could have put a tiny bit of dirt on top, and vandals never would have found it. So I believe that the Issei were very active agents in this, defying the so-called agreement, which was really just an order to erect the monument, and then burying it in a way that it could be found again.
Thank you for bringing that up, because the Issei, the immigrant generation, is my grandparents, my grandfather. And because they didn't speak English or very much, and I didn't speak Japanese, we couldn't really communicate. And in the World War II history, their story is the least known. And so to me, this awesome, as you say, badass, it's nearly 5 feet tall. It's 57 inches. And if it's 1,000 pounds, this is their voice.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yes. Yeah, they are not going to be silenced.
And so as a civil rights monument, as a monument of resistance, the Issei haven't been thought in that way. And so I think this gives us a whole new interpretation of history.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. Most of the stories just talk about how the Issei were sad and crying and reclusive, and no, okay, maybe some of them, sometimes they were, but maybe they're also super powerful, expressing themselves, and they're outraged. How could you move that big of a rock unless you were outraged?
And then I also, when I found the map at the time, I just thought it was really amazing because it was a detailed map. But then you went out to the desert and found this, the tip of the iceberg, which was a clue, as you said before. So it seems to me more and more that the map was a clue waiting to be found. The stone was buried in the desert with a little bit showing a clue to be found. And they left these clues for us. And I just find that amazingly moving and powerful.
Yeah. Thank the Issei for that. That is a very important legacy, not just for Mr. Wakasa, but for all of them.
And I think that's why I was so emotional when I learned that it had been removed without any Japanese Americans present and without any consultation, because it felt like, frankly, World War II and the oppression that my parents and my family experienced, how much had changed, because we weren't told. We weren't told that the sentry was acquitted. No one ever learned that. He was acquitted and then sent out. He was a 19-year-old from North Carolina. We know that now. The memorial was never in the newspaper, in the camp newspaper. So many of these secrets were kept from us. And then this again was done hastily and by someone who was cleaning debris from a different part of the camp. And it made me incredibly sad and also angry.
Yeah. Understandably so, Nancy. A terrible lost opportunity.
Lost opportunity.
Maybe that's too light to say, but as soon as, to see something like that, you think, like you say, this is a sign. This is a sign from your ancestors. It's a symbol meant to be found and honored.
It's so precarious, because if I hadn't happened to find that in that particular file, if you hadn't brought your decades of experience and said, oh, that's not just this flat thing that 2 professional surveys before hadn't seen. It's so precarious that this could have been found. It's a miracle.
It is a miracle. I'm so happy to be part of that miracle, and I'm so sorry that it led to that desecration. Something's not connected.
It also, I think, strengthens my generation. I'm a Sansei. I was, my grandparents were immigrants. My parents were the first generation to be born here. And I feel it really strengthens my sense of connection to that immigrant generation and the spirit that maybe we didn't really understand, or we had no evidence of it in this way. And so it's interesting because there might be other signs of resistance and evidence, such as an underground dark room or basements that people carved under the barrack to stay cool in the summer. But to actually have this archaeological artifact be a purposeful memorial to someone who was killed, murdered by the government, and then covered up by the forced to be covered up has just a lot more meaning. I'm not sure there's anything like that. And somebody has said that, a historian said, if this is true, this is probably the most important archaeological find in all the camps. Is that your assessment?
Oh gosh, I don't know what to say to that, Nancy. It had a lot of meaning for us, but it's for the community to decide. I think that maybe it's true. If the community recognizes it as a symbol of murder, brutality, and resistance, it's got a lot embedded in it, doesn't it?
Racial violence.
Yeah. Wow, that's a very excellent point, Gary.
Where do you put this in your long career in terms of just the personal, the professional, the emotional impact of finding this? And also, frankly, the controversy that's ensued. I mean, it's been quite a journey for you.
Working with the Japanese American community is definitely a highlight of my career. Finding something so meaningful to them is so gratifying, because I think I want to be in service of that, in service of remembering what happened, and in service of civil rights. It's very much an honor to be able to use archaeology as a way to further civil rights. I think I got into it because I wanted to work outside, but to be able to think that you might be uncovering truth and fighting for justice, that is such an honor. And it only happens because the Japanese American community recognizes the importance of the work. And that's because they know the importance of the place. We're just documenting what's left at the places. So it is very, very much important. I have mixed feelings though, because of the way the museum removed the rock. If we had known that was going to happen, we would have just gone out there and sat on it. I mean, we wouldn't. Okay, that would be disrespectful, sitting on it, but we would have stood in front of the forklift, right? Because I'm not sure. It just seems like that part of this has been one of the worst experiences of my career. The fact that something we thought had such an importance and symbolism was taken that way.
And what you're saying makes me think also of our Japanese American, Asian American connection to the way that ancestral land is treated, or traditionally has been treated in our history. And I'm thinking that one person said, the people who did this don't have the same feeling towards the land, ancestral land, as, say, the Native Americans do, which we also appreciate. And I was thinking of the Tulsa race massacre, which occurred in Oklahoma in 1923, and how 1920 anyway, and how the graves are being exhumed very carefully. But the land holds so many tragic stories, and so I'm really looking at our history and the land and how people have suffered and how people of color also share this history of having reverence for what happened, not knowing what happened, and trying to learn the truth. What kind of process do you think would be one that could help repair or at least address what's been done?
Oh, Nancy, that's not for me to say. I believe that would be for the community. I hope, I mean, Jeff and I don't care if we're blamed for anything as long as the community can heal. Topaz Museum has done a lot of good. And so I don't want, I mean, I don't want this to be glossed over, but I don't want it to be in the way of healing. I hope that there are more people at the 80th anniversary of his death than there were at his funeral. That's more than 2,000 people. Oh, what a pleasure to see you and talk to you, even though it made me cry.
Thank you, Mary. We owe so much to you and archaeology, which is bringing our history alive for us.
We've worked on older sites and more glamorous sites, but there are no sites as important, as heartfelt as the incarceration sites to us. So thank you. Thanks for sharing your map and those documents too.
Mary, I can't thank you enough for today. I mean, I learned so much. Mm-hmm. And, you know, email just doesn't do it.
You're right about that. Yeah, I did too. I have learned a lot today too. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's quite an honor.
Please give our best to Jeff.
Okay, I will.
Well, hello. It's a long time since we were able to actually chat live here, but we are live now. So if anybody has any questions, and there have been lots of comments in the chat, which we will get to, but I want to go ahead and let our panelists introduce themselves. So Mary, do you want to just introduce yourself first?
Sure. I'm Mary Farrell. I've worked with Jeff Burton, my husband, since 1980. And one of our favorite things to do is to work on the Japanese American sites of confinement because they are so important to civil rights during World War II, but also to civil rights today.
Great. And then Nancy.
Okay, hi, I'm Nancy Ukai. I'm a Sansei. I was born in Berkeley, and more than a dozen of my relatives were incarcerated at Topaz. I also had a half-sister who died at childbirth. So my mother saved this document, which I'm going to share shortly, and it was a train pass which she was forced to take when she left art school in LA in order to return to Berkeley so the family would be separated into different camps. And three things about that have stayed with me. Thanks, Kimiko. I've highlighted them. One says she's an alien enemy, permit to travel, which she was born in the United States. She was a native of the USA, it said. And also it said that she was not returning, which was very poignant to me. She didn't ever return to LA, her fingerprints in the bottom. And then the other item she saved for the family was her indefinite leave card, which showed that she left in September 1943. So she was at Topaz when Mr. Wakasa was killed, and that had a big impact on her. So anyway, thank you so much, Kimiko, for hosting this today.
No, thank you so much for making the time. And then Masako, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Masako Takahashi. I was born in Topaz. My mother and father were incarcerated there. My brother and I were born there. My grandparents were there. And my parents, Henry and Tomoya Takahashi, have formed a family charitable foundation. And the foundation wants to award Mary Farrell, Jeff Burton, and Nancy Ukai a Medal Award of Merit for this fantastic discovery and location of what to us, Japanese Americans, is a substantial, concrete, major find, evidence of the threat and terror that our families live through on a daily basis. Some of us are starting to live it again on the streets of the United States again today, shockingly enough, let alone then, when they could have no place else to go. Anyway, we have joy in our community because of you guys and your work, your efforts. It's very exciting, and you deserve to be awarded. There's going to be an event, an upcoming event, a Topaz reunion kind of thing at the Japanese American Cultural Center in San Francisco. The dates are still to be determined. But we're so happy about the discovery. It's so major. Thank you.
And I will go to the audience comments, questions in a minute, but I just have a question actually for you, Mary. Now that this has happened, what, because I'm not an archaeologist clearly, so is there more information that can be gleaned by having an archaeologist team go out there now, or like geologists go out there to look at the actual stone itself, or are there things that can still happen moving forward to at least get what little information might be left to at least try to figure something out?
Absolutely. In the comments, Dana Shu has pointed out that there's are ways to retrieve information that still might be at that particular spot. Topaz in general is a very powerful place. There, as the Topaz Museum Board commissioned an archaeologist to survey it about 20 years ago, there's a tremendous amount of cultural material there, both artifacts and features. So yes, there's plenty still that could be done.
Okay. All right, let me get to some questions. Some of them I've already answered in the chat. So forgive me, everybody, if I don't go over those again. One question that was in here was, where is the monument now, and what is its condition? Where is it being kept? That was asked a couple times here in the chat. Anybody have an answer?
Jane Beckwith sent me a photograph of the stone that was shown during his last playthrough here. And it had dark spots on it, which he described as from the rain. So it's somewhere in the rain. Presumably on the museum grounds, but that's just presumably. I really actually don't know.
Right, and the Wakasa Memorial Committee has not received any photographs, video.
As far as I know,
reports.
The Wakasa Committee sent the Topaz Museum Board a letter about this and asked for 6 things to be addressed, and no response has come directly from them covering those 6 points. I do gather that they like the idea we proposed that there will be a memorial for James Wakasa on the 80th anniversary of his death, which would be in 2023.
Right.
Hopefully at the site in Topaz.
And so we do have a question here, just came in from Kimmy Hill, how is the Wakasa Memorial Committee guaranteeing that there is a fair and balanced dissemination of information about this sensitive subject?
Oh, by the way, can I just add,
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
actually not on the Wakasa committee, but I kind of inserted myself in this,
Right.
today.
We wanted to have you here as a survivor, as a person that was actually in.
I'm very, I find myself quite touched by this story. I was so happy to hear about the map, the discovery of the map, and then the Mary Farrell and Jeff Burton actually physically going and finding it. I mean, the whole story was so thrilling, and wanting to be able to contribute to some proper archaeological excavation with video and ceremony. Anyway, that was a big disappointment, at which I had offered those things to Jane, but they were not taken up by her. But
Well,
we're hoping to be able to have a ceremony and be able to honor James Wakasa and be able to help to contribute to proper conservation of the memorial stone.
Well, I think, you know, Kimiko, you're a descendant, I'm a descendant, but Masako, you are a survivor, and your family has been such a long time financial supporter of the museum. So I think it's good to have your voice.
My family, thank you for bringing that up. My family was early funder of Jane's before there was a museum, but when it was just an idea for a museum. Many decades of heavy funding. So until this happened, in fact, that's why I even had her email, and I wrote to her saying, hey, that's so great. Allow us to fund a ceremony and the proper archaeological excavation. And so this is a letter that I have made public even on their own. I sent it to the museum, Topaz Museum Facebook page. I'm not trying to have any secrets from anybody about what happened and how I feel about it.
And I think that, you know, thank you also for announcing this award to me and to Mary and Jeff. I mean, that's kind of astounding. And they talk about paying it forward, but I think I would love to pay it backward to the Issei. And, you know, Wakasa was an Issei. George Shimamoto, who drew that diagram, was an Issei. And then those heroic landscapers. It's just an amazing immigrant story that we all share. And I do want to, you know, address, I think Kimmy Hill asked a question about how this future conversation can be fair. And the Wakasa Memorial Committee formed quickly after this happened because we needed a way to ask questions and then formulate a plan to move forward. And that's why the committee formed and created this 6-step proposal. And one of the first things is let's have a memorandum of agreement to properly communicate and set some rules about how we would like this process of discussion to continue. And I think in this process of forming a memorandum of agreement, we should discuss about how to include many voices in the community. We don't claim to represent everybody by any means. And another thing is let's have professional mediation. Let's have an archaeological assessment. Let's please collaborate so we can get survivor and descendant voices to collaborate on the treatment, the interpretation, the curation, and talk about how this memorial site in the stone can be treated in the future, because at one point, the stone and the memorial site were one thing, and now they're two separate things. How do we repair physically the archaeological damage that's been done by not having an archaeologist? How do we repair the spiritual damage that's been done to our community and the pain, which has divided us, frankly? And we're trying to be diplomatic. Diplomats we have hearts and we have heads, and our hearts, we're trying to do both. So the heart doesn't forget the pain and the grief, and we're still going through it. But we're also trying to think how are ways to include many voices in our discussions going forward. And I think a memorandum of agreement is probably the first step.
Well, and actually, Nancy, now you brought up the 6 points. Do you want to actually go over them? I made a little graphic here. I did it really quick, so please pardon any typos. But
So
you want to explain this?
I think that I just sort of explained them briefly, but I think it lays out some basic things that are important to discuss going forward, and people should just read the letter that was sent September 7th to the Topaz Museum Board. It's on our website, wacasamemorial.org, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation a week later came out and supported especially the idea of having a memorandum of agreement, of having professional mediation, and archaeological assessment, and a partnership with the Topaz Museum Board in discussing these very important steps to move our community forward so that we can look to the future and have a reconciliation, but facts need to be brought out, and an accounting of what happened needs to be examined so that these mistakes, these decisions won't be repeated, because there might be other things in the land. It was shocking to know that this civil rights monument was there on the west fence of the camp.
Okay, let me see. I'm scrolling through. I think we've answered a lot of these. If somebody feels like we didn't answer or address a question. Oh, here's one from Mary Hiroshima, sorry. Mary says, my question is that the death certificate says Mr. Wakasa was taken to Nichols and Sons Mortuary in Delta and not to Ogden. What documentation is there that he was taken to Ogden?
I remember reading in a National Archive file that he was cremated in Ogden, but maybe the autopsy was done at the Nichols Mortuary. And another interesting detail is that Dr. Goto, who was a doctor at Manzanar during the Manzanar Revolt and was apparently sent to Topaz because he refused to sign death certificates about how the two men were killed, signed a medical document for Wakasa. So I thought that trauma of that doctor going from Manzanar, where two men were killed by, in the revolt, and then had to sign an autopsy for Wakasa just a few months later in Utah, is something that perhaps people are not aware of.
Okay, we have another question. Can you talk more about the Utah Heritage official who visited Topaz? What was the purpose of the visit and what happened after?
My understanding, according to an archaeologist at the state office, is that the Topaz Museum Board contacted them on July 21st and said, can you attend an excavation on the 27th? The archaeologist said, literally, I was double booked. And so they sent a heritage official in his place. And that heritage official was not an archaeologist, but he did take photographs. And that's where the photographs came from, the ones of the forklift dragging the stone from the hole. But we really don't know a whole lot beyond that. And I think it would be useful to talk about the roles of these different agencies in this excavation.
Okay, and we have another question here from Florence. How do you feel about the personal statement and apology that was recently made by Jane Beckwith, the president of the board? Does anybody have a response? I know it's pretty new for most of us, so I think we're still processing. I mean, I can speak for myself and just say, as a member of the committee, I appreciate the acknowledgement, and again, I'm just speaking for myself because we have not had a meeting about this, but I feel like it's time to move forward and just be able to communicate directly with the museum board about where to go from here. I don't think there's any reason to continue to litigate But I don't know how you all feel.
I agree. I think it's a positive step forward, and it's good that finally we're talking, because we sent our letter on September 7th, and it's been 5 weeks, and this letter arrived via a third party, but we would like to communicate directly with the Topaz Museum Board, and let's make some progress and move forward. I think it's a good thing. Masako?
My concerns are for the physical stone and the physical site, the Topaz site. I'm very urgently worried about the stone being in a non-archival space outside, where it's going to be snowing and raining, and the rain gets in a rock and then it freezes and the whole stone cracks, or I don't want it in a freezing garage at somebody's house, or it's got to be a situation where conservation is our next major concern. That's my feeling. Okay, I'm really, my attention is on that. The honoring of the entire event, Mr. Wakasa's killing, his murder, the cover-up, and more fabulously, the uncovering, discovery and uncovering and recovery of the memory, the story, and now the conservation of the stone, where it can be used as a social justice tool. This can be something that will be honoring the memory of our ancestors as people who cared. We need to care about them.
And I think the significance of this stone as a symbol of resistance is so important, because it changes the nature of how we think about Topaz, about the National Historic Landmark, about the fact that Topaz is often characterized as a quiet place. Well, this magnificent voice of protest was forced to be buried, and it makes us rethink some of the stories that we've been told. And before it's too late, how about if we kind of gather these stories and enrich our understanding, not only of the Wakasa killing, but of people's experience of Topaz. Today, the Wakasa Memorial webpage just received an email from a Topaz descendant, and she said, "My grandmother was incarcerated at Topaz. Before her passing, she wrote briefly about the shooting of Mr. Wakasa." People still carry this in their heart. These memories are just embedded in their soul, their memory, and we need to recapture these stories as much as we can, and honor the incarcerees, honor Mr. Wakasa's life, honor those Issei heroes.
And we need to stand up. We need to stand up and speak out.
And I think we all share the deep feeling that this place is important, and this land is important, and it's also very troubled land. And I'm just concerned now too how we can preserve the memorial landscape. And Mary, thank you for all that you've told us today about the archaeological evaluation that needs to be done in this period, now that professionals weren't there before, but now perhaps we can bring them in as part of the process going forward.
Okay, so we have another question here. Has there ever been an exhibit consisting of an accounting of all the people killed by the authorities in the concentration camps? I don't think I've ever seen one.
Densho has definitely a page in the Densho Encyclopedia dedicated to this topic.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, but of course, I really became very interested in James Wakasa because I started doing research on it for the Topaz Museum script, and learned that he went to Keio College. He studied at the University of Wisconsin for 2 years. He was a really educated guy. He went to a prep school in Tokyo. And so the myth about him was that he was this deaf man who was elderly with a dog. And in fact, he was really well traveled. He was an optimist about America. He kept a portrait of Abraham Lincoln in his barrack. There's just so much to learn about each of these people who were killed by homicides in the camps, and that's a good idea to have such an exhibition, I think.
And actually something, this isn't one of the audience questions, but we talked about this earlier, how in Ken Verdoya's documentary, he mentioned that there had been 8 other not fatal, but 8 other shootings before James Wakasa had been shot, and the camp had only been open for less than a year. And Nancy, you said you had found some of that documentation, or you have some of that documentation. Do you like, what were the circumstances?
The military records record 8 shootings by guards from guard towers before Wakasa, he was the 9th, took place. And we'll post them on our website. But if that's the recorded events, you can only imagine things that might not have gone recorded. And they weren't I don't think they were in the Topaz Times. So that was the thing. This history gets erased, buried, canceled, distorted, covered up, and we're still a little bit in the dark unless you really do some deep research. So I think one of the things it would be great to do, for example, there's a document that has a list of, I think, something like 68 Issei and Nisei who are on the Wakasa committee. And I look at that list, and there are grandchildren and children of those people in the Bay Area. So, let's talk story.
Maybe if anybody, no matter whether they are friends or relatives or of anybody who was at Topaz, if you have any information, please go to our website and let us know. The WakasaMemorial.org.
Yes, and I also, in the description of this live stream, is our email address, is the Wakasa Committee email address. So yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, Masako. If anybody has stories, family stories that were passed down, because obviously the people who might have real solid memories would be in their probably mid-90s by now.
Yes,
but
I went to a birthday party, and the woman in her 90s, and she remembered it.
And then there was also that man that wrote you, Nancy, that said he remembered being a small boy at the funeral, right? That he had that memory and never spoke about it, even in a Densho oral history, because he had other more traumatic, unfortunately, events that happened to him. But.
That was Roy Ebihara, who now lives in Ohio, and he was 9 years old at the time. And bless him, he read our 50 Objects story. He said, I was reading it on my iPad, and I had to write you that I was always collecting flint and objects in the desert, and I would always see this man, Mr. Wakasa. Maybe I saw him 6 or 7 times, and one night we passed, and when I was going back to the barracks, I heard this pop, pop, he said. And he said, I ran as fast as I could. And the next morning, he found that Mr. Wakasa had been killed. The military came to interview him. He went to the funeral, and he's always remembered seeing the open casket, hearing the hymn, Rock of Ages. And he said, such memories are hard to erase. And so I really thank him for writing, and I think there may be other stories out there which are important to collect, not only for our community, but for American history.
And there was a question about, is Densho involved at all doing oral histories? And, of course, they've been doing oral histories for 25 years now. I think the issue is that people have not spoken about James Wakasa. It's either something they're not wanting to talk about, or possibly it's not discussed. Maybe it's that traumatic. I can imagine it being that traumatic, because as one of the women in Ken Verdoya's film said, you didn't know if you were going to be shot. You had no idea. And especially if 8 other shootings had occurred prior to that, you feel very unsafe. So I can see why people might not want to remember those types of things. So I think it's actually, at this point, maybe a matter of asking specific questions of people who were alive and letting them know that it's okay to talk about if they want to. I think, Nancy, your mom was actually just kind of special in that she talked about it with you as a child, because I know my family never spoke about James Wakasa, and part of my family lived, I think he was in block 36, and part of my family lived in block 39. So it's not that far away, but I don't remember anybody mentioning it. So it could just be something that trauma has locked away, and you have to kind of give somebody permission to talk.
Someone named Tom Akashi was interviewed by Densho, and he talks about how his father used to sit in the boiler room with Wakasa, and they would talk. And it's poignant. I think that, you know, it's late now to be asking people, but we should still do as best as we can. Yeah.
And also, actually, this is random, but we should also point out that the picture that often circulates about that says claims to be James Wakasa in front of a storefront with a dog is not, in fact, James Wakasa. I don't know if we know who that really is, but it's not James Wakasa, right, Nancy?
Yeah, that photograph it's misidentified on Wiki Commons, and it's been properly identified, but yeah.
We don't have any photographs of him, do we?
No, although I've contacted a genealogist in Japan, and he's working hard to see if he can find descendants, because we still don't know what happened to the ashes. It could be that some ashes were, you know, put in the hole when the monument was buried, but at any rate, there is a WRA file where it's very poignant, again, where the inmate says, what should I do with these? I can't find any next of kin. And then as of the following year, Wakasa's belongings still hadn't been claimed. And so it's sad to think about things just being kind of, you know, dispersed, and we don't know what happened to them. Yeah.
So we're getting kind of long on time. I know people are probably tired. So I think this one last question from Yuri Young would sum it up. What are things we can do to support this whole process? Good question. Good question. Well, we have our 6 points, and I know that the Topaz board has sort of addressed a couple of them, not directly. So I think, you know, if the first step would be amazing if we could just speak directly in a meeting.
Please come to the website, wakasamemorial.org, and the Facebook page or Instagram, whichever is most convenient for you, and mention if you support it. Please mention that. That would be extremely valuable to know that there's some support for what we're trying to do here. Personally, I am very strongly urging the community to move the stone to an archivally adequate, you know, professional space where it can be accessible to the public and to researchers. For example, the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, whose mission it is to educate the public on exactly this kind of thing. Anyway, or the Smithsonian.
Well, I think that, you know, when we establish a process of communication and basically negotiation about how to manage this process of many voices in the community, I would just urge that young person to please stay engaged, go to the website and write to us. People do that frequently. And whether you're Topaz descendant or not, we really appreciate your interest in preserving history, because as someone wrote today, they said, objects carry stories and they outlast the people who made them, but not if they're not protected. And so we're all together here to preserve, and really appreciate your interest and, you know, engagement in this. It's our responsibility for the next generations.
We need your support.
And I'm going to sneak in one last question here, because I think you have an answer for this, Nancy. So Lisa Ponder asked, if he attended University of Wisconsin, there may be photos there, yearbooks, student clubs, newspapers. You had somebody doing research there, right?
Yes, someone who is a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee was going to reach out to contacts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but that would be great. It would be really wonderful to try and reconstruct some of the, you know, life experiences of James Wakasa before he landed in San Francisco and then went to Tanforan, where he started to file claims for unemployment. After he got leave clearance, you're free to go work. And he said, hey, I've been in the union for many, many years. Please pay me my unemployment insurance. And the state of California said, well, you can't leave your prison, so no. And then the WRA actually said, he is free to leave. He's been cleared on indefinite leave. And so actually the day before he died, he received a letter from the WRA giving him permission to respond to this claim, which I don't think he ever got. And it's very poignant, but in the law office at the WRA in Topaz, an anonymous legal person wrote, Wakasa used to come in and he was very curious and very interested in the letter of the law. He wasn't annoying, but he did want to know the justification for any ruling that was made. And once you told him, he was satisfied, but he said he wasn't doing it for the money. And this really moved me when I read it. He was doing it for the community. He knew that it was a token payment. And I thought how much more of the humanity that we don't know about people in the camps. It's not just 120,000 people, they're all individuals. And now we're learning more about him. And especially because of this monument that Mary and Jeff rediscovered for us. So Mary and Jeff, thank you.
Yes. And now I do think that is the perfect ending, because I think I would just like to reiterate to everybody watching that we all care about this a lot on both sides. And we have a common goal, is to remember this history and to make it available for generations to come. And so we all want to come to a resolution on this. Nobody is enjoying this infighting in the community. And so I want to just also mention again what Masako brought up earlier, is that it would be wonderful to have an event, a coming together of the Topaz and Tanforan descendant and survivor community in the Bay Area sometime. We don't know when, but I think that would be an amazing thing to have us all come together and just talk about our relatives and our ancestors that were in those two prison camps.
And let's not construe statements of pain about something that shouldn't have happened as being public attacks, because facts are not attacks. And I think we all want the facts so that we can understand what happened and make sure that something like this doesn't happen again, not just at Topaz, but anywhere, in any of the camps in our American history. So,
well, at any American history, not even just Japanese American, right? In any group,
yeah,
it shouldn't happen. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for going late into the night here. It's like pitch black now. I appreciate everybody for tuning in and watching. And again, this video is available at this same link. So even if you've missed the first half or whatever, you can watch it later. You can share it with your friends. And please do reach out to the committee to just, let us know if you have suggestions or ideas for anything, for a celebration or anything. We want to hear from the community, because that's what this is really about. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Masako. Thank you, Kamiko.
Bye.
And thank you for coming.